The economy is a living thing. It breathes through trade flows and investment streams. It feeds on consumer spending and exports. It produces waste in the form of inefficiencies and bad loans. And sometimes it slips into a coma where vital signs flicker but the core functions grind to a halt. The world looks at China and sees a dragon, fierce, ancient, coiled for another surge. I look at the reports, the balance sheets, the quarterly filings, and I see a patient hooked up to life support in a dimly lit ward. Machines hum, injecting liquidity to keep the heart pumping, but the underlying decay spreads unchecked. This isn't hyperbole drawn from thin air. It's the reality, pieced together from central bank data, IMF assessments, and the quiet admissions in Beijing's policy papers. 10 trillion yuan. That is the scale of the latest intervention, equivalent to about $1.5 trillion at current exchange rates. Beijing frames it as a rescue package, a targeted stimulus to jolt the system back to life. They rolled it out in late 2024 with annual quotas of 2 trillion yuan each year through 2026. It is aimed at swapping out hidden local debts for more manageable central obligations. I see it differently. A delay of the inevitable. It's like administering a strong dose of painkillers with someone with advanced cancer. 10 trillion yuan buys time. It numbs the immediate agony. But the real tumor, the shadow debt piled up over decades, looms 6 times larger, around 66 trillion yuan by mid-2025 estimates from the IMF. And that debt isn't static. It's metastasizing through refinancings, rollovers, and fresh borrowing disguised as infrastructure projects. To understand this, you have to step back and trace the veins of the system. China's growth model, the one that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty and built the world's factory, relied on a simple equation. Pour concrete, inflate GDP, reward the builders. Local governments, starved for revenue under a fiscal structure that funnels most taxes to the center, turn to off-balance sheet vehicles to fund it all. This shadow lending created a parallel financial universe, one where debts multiplied without scrutiny. Now, as growth slows, projected at just 4.1% for 2026 by Fitch Ratings, the cracks are widening. Welcome to Imperial Audit. Today, we're not just examining an economy, we're performing an autopsy on a system that borrowed so aggressively from the future that the future has quietly backed away, leaving a ledger full of IOUs no one can collect. Let's face facts, starting with the numbers that don't lie. China's official government debt, the kind reported in glossy annual summaries, stands at around 90% of GDP as we head into 2026. That is the facade, the polished storefront where Beijing points to fiscal prudence and sustainable ratios. But peel back the layers and you find the local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. These aren't sexy terms from a thriller novel. They're bureaucratic inventions, shell companies set up by provinces and cities to skirt borrowing caps. Fitch Ratings pegs the debt servicing gap for these entities alone at 34 trillion yuan. As of early 2026, that is a chasm that swallows entire budgets. In total, LGFV liabilities have ballooned to 65.6 trillion yuan, according to the IMF's latest reckoning. This pushes the augmented government debt, official plus off-books, to 124% of GDP. Add in corporate and household borrowings, and the full picture edges toward 300% when shadow elements are factored in. These aren't abstract percentages, they're concrete burdens. Consider the mechanics. Back in the early 2000s, as China joined the WTO and export boom took hold, local officials faced a bind. The central government controlled the purse strings, allocating just 20 to 30% of tax revenues back to provinces while mandating ambitious growth targets. Miss those, and careers stalled. So cities like Ordos in Inner Mongolia or Ujiapu in Tianjin spawned LGFVs.
state-owned enterprises in name only, borrowing from banks against future land sales or toll revenues. A typical cycle, the LGFV issues bonds or secures bank loans at favorable rates. It funnels the cash into roads, subways, or office towers. GDP surges on paper, the official gets promoted, and the debt? It hides in the LGFV's ledgers, reclassified as corporate rather than public. This worked for 2 decades because land was the golden goose. Local governments owned all urban land, leasing it out in 40 to 70-year plots to developers. Prices soared, up 20 to 30% annually in the boom years, providing collateral for even more loans. But by 2016, the model cracked. The property sector, which accounted for 25 to 30% of GDP, began to wobble under Xi Jinping's 3 red lines policy, which capped developer leverage. Evergrande's 2021 default was the Canary. Now, housing starts are down 60% from their peaks. Unsold inventory piles up like forgotten relics. Fast forward to the balance sheets. By the end of 2024, non-financial corporate debt, including LGFVs, hit 172% of GDP. The IMF has been blunt. If even 5% of these vehicles default, it could trigger a cascade, spiking non-performing loans by 75% and straining banks already saddled with 40 trillion yuan in exposure. That is not a crisis. It's a mathematical dead end, a place where liabilities exceed assets by multiples, and refinancing becomes a game of musical chairs with fewer seats each round. Up until 2023, the whole apparatus ran on a fragile faith. Faith that Beijing would step in with a bailout. Faith that land values would keep climbing, turning scrub into speculative gold. Faith that pouring concrete equated to progress. Banks extended credit liberally, while regulators turned a blind eye to the opacity. LGFVs issued bonds like clockwork, 1.4 trillion yuan net in 2023 alone, greasing the wheels of local ambition. But in 2024, the music stopped, abruptly. The LGFV bond market, once a steady drip of issuance, collapsed under the weight of rising defaults and investor skepticism.
Net borrowing plummeted to just 152 billion yuan. That is a 10-fold drop from the prior year. Creditors, from domestic funds to offshore holders, finally woke up to the emperor's nakedness. Collateral values evaporating, revenues from land sales halved, and provinces like Guizhou or Yunnan staring down multi-trillion yuan shortfalls. Over 7,000 LGFVs effectively exited the market in 2024, dissolving or merging to shed liabilities. But the debts didn't vanish. They shifted to balance sheets elsewhere, often to central state-owned enterprises or banks forced to absorb the rot. Take the bond yields as a tell. Average rates on LGFV paper fell from 4.1% in 2023 to 2.7% in 2024. This wasn't driven by confidence, but by forced interventions, central bank purchases, and policy mandates to keep yields artificially low. Defaults hit record levels. 60 non-standard products tied to LGFVs failed or signaled distress in the first 9 months of 2024. That's a 20% jump year over year. And the land underneath it all? Obsolete. Housing prices have declined for 5 straight years in Tier 2 and 3 cities. New home sales down 15% in 2025, despite every stimulus nudge. Banks holding trillions in depreciated collateral are left with air. Loans backed by plots that fetch half their peak values, if they sell at all. Beijing's response? The 10 trillion yuan debt substitution program. Announced in November 2024, it sounds muscular on paper. Swap high-interest local debts for lower-yield central bonds. Ease annual interest payments by an estimated 600 billion yuan. Layer on special sovereign bonds totaling 11.2 trillion yuan, issued across 2024 and 2025. Ultra-long-term treasuries added another 1.3 trillion in 2025 quotas.
It covers a third of the 34 trillion yuan funding gap Fitch identifies for LGFV maturities through 2026. The rest? 24 trillion yuan demands refinancing. But who steps up? Domestic banks are tapped out. Non-performing loan ratios are creeping toward 2.5%. Offshore markets have tightened. LGFV dollar bond net outflows hit 6.2% of 2025 maturities. Lending to what amounts to a corpse isn't charity, it's suicide for the lender. This isn't isolated to spreadsheets. The mechanics ripple into the real world, grinding down the gears of daily life. You've seen the drone footage, vast expanses of unfinished high-rises in places like Kangbashi, streets designed for 1 million residents echoing with silence, concrete skeletons rusting under perpetual drizzle, cranes idle like forgotten sentinels. These aren't anomalies, they are the endpoints of a borrowing binge that prioritized quantity over utility. In 2025, local infrastructure spending fell 8% year over year as provinces rationed funds for debt service over new projects.
But the decay's symptoms run deeper than steel and mortar. They're etched into the routines of ordinary people. In provinces like Henan or Sichuan, government salaries have been trimmed by 10 to 20% since mid-2024. Some officials are foregoing bonuses outright just to meet austerity quotas. Teachers in rural Gansu were asked in late 2025 to repay portions of their 2023 incentives. They framed it as shared fiscal responsibility. Buses in smaller cities like Baotou now run on reduced schedules, stranding commuters in the chill of northern winters. Street cleaning crews, once a fixture of urban order, operated at half strength in coastal hubs like Qingdao, leaving trash to accumulate in the gutters, a visible marker of stretched resources. Finance professionals call this austerity, belt-tightening to preserve liquidity. In plain terms, it is social breakdown in slow motion. Local governments, which employ 1 in 10 urban workers, are cannibalizing their own operations to service debts that average 40% of their budgets. A World Bank update from December 2025 notes that local direct debt alone claims 35% of GDP in servicing costs. It is crowding out spending on health, education, and welfare. Innovation? Starved. Venture capital inflows to tech startups dropped 25% in 2025. Why? Because banks are redirecting capital to zombie LGFVs, entities kept alive not by profits but by policy fiat. Money that could fund AI labs or renewable grids instead pays interest on bridges spanning empty valleys, roads leading to ghost malls. Zoom out and the human cost compounds. Youth unemployment hovered at 15% through 2025. Graduates are funneled into civil service exams, offering stability over opportunity, only to find those jobs shrinking under fiscal knives. Migrant workers, the backbone of the construction boom, face wage arrears totaling billions. In Guangdong factories, delays stretched to 6 months by mid-2025. Consumption, the holy grail Beijing chases to rebalance the economy, remains anemic. Retail sales grew just 3.5% in 2025, half the pre-pandemic pace. Households are hoarding cash amid property slumps and pension uncertainties. The system devours itself to eke out another quarter's survival. Banks, once engines of growth, morph into zombies. Injections of 800 billion yuan barely stemmed the bleed. Resources are locked into perpetuating the old model, rolling over LGFV loans at subsidized rates, while real economy credit shrinks. A factory in Shenzhen might wait months for a line of credit, only to see those funds diverted to prop up a provincial water utilities bonds. This isn't inefficiency, it is extraction, siphoning vitality from productive sectors to nurse the indebted core. And the externalities? They seep beyond borders. China's deflationary pressures, with producer prices down 2.5% in 2025, flood global markets with cheap steel and solar panels, undercutting manufacturers in Vietnam, India,
even the US Rust Belt. Trade partners absorb the slack, but at the cost of their own jobs and industries. Meanwhile, foreign investors, burned by LGFV opacity, pull back. Portfolio outflows hit $100 billion in 2025, per central bank tallies.
So, who foots the bill for this reckoning? The 10 trillion yuan isn't conjured from the party's coffers. The party doesn't hold a balance sheet like that. It's drawn from taxpayers. Chinese workers whose VAT and income taxes fund the swaps, savers whose deposits underpin bank loans, and indirectly global holders of yuan assets, diluted in the process. Beijing's strategy is methodical, if grim. Transfer liabilities from regional pockets to the central one, leveraging the sovereign's unlimited printing press. Inflation will do the rest, eroding the real value of debts over time, though at the expense of retirees' nest eggs and wage earners' purchasing power. Projections peg CPI at 1.5% for 2026, but with property drags, it could dip negative again, exporting deflation westward. The broader play involves ultra-long bonds, and fiscal deficits widen to 4% of GDP in 2025. It's a shell game. Regions offload to the center issues debt to banks, and banks buy with PBOC reserves. But sustainability? Questionable. Total social financing, the broadest credit measure, topped 430 trillion yuan by mid-2025. It is growing at its slowest pace since the pandemic. Defaults, while contained through extend and pretend tactics, erode trust. Offshore LGFV financing, once a lifeline, has contracted sharply. Net outflows signal capital flight. In poorer provinces, the strain borders on crisis. Guizhou, with LGFV debts exceeding 2 trillion yuan, slashed public works by 30% in 2025, idling thousands of laborers. Yunnan faces similar squeezes, relying on central transfers that cover just half the gap. Without bailouts, selective defaults loom. IMF scenarios warn of systemic risks if the chains of LGFV bank interlinks snap. Beijing avoids the D word, opting for mergers and asset sales. But the math doesn't bend. Debt growth decelerated to 4.4% in 2024, yet the stockpile endures. The patient is in a coma now, vital signs stabilized by ventilators of policy. Doctors in Zhongnanhai debate dosages. More bonds, deeper cuts, but the family, the Chinese public, hears only assurances of recovery. No one voices the hard truth. The brain, the innovative, adaptive core that drove 10% growth eras, flatlined years ago. It died under deleveraging edicts and zero COVID scars. What's left are reflexes, export pushes, subsidy injections, debt shuffles, and the ledger, a monument of red ink that will outlast us all. A cautionary archive for the next dragon to ponder. This was Imperial Audit. Next, the dollar's turn under the microscope.